They call this stretch of coastline the graveyard of the Pacific, and for good reason. The shoreline here is a jagged, broken jaw of black basalt cliffs, sea stacks, and submerged reefs that have sunk ships and claimed lives for as long as people have sailed these waters. The ocean is never calm, never blue. It is a deep, steely gray, heavy with cold and power, crashing against the rocks with a roar that never truly stops, day or night. And above it all hangs the mist, thick, wet, and endless. It rolls in from the open sea like a living thing, swallowing headlands, forests, and roads, turning the world into nothing but white silence and damp cold. At 35 years old, Nicholas Tilson, I've spent half my life away from this place. I grew up here, in the shadow of the station, listening to my grandfather tell stories about the weather, the tides, and the things that move in the gray spaces between land and sea. But when I was 18, I left. I went east, to cities where the sun actually shone, where you could see more than 100 yards in front of your face, where the air didn't taste of salt and wet stone and ancient rot. I built a life there, a normal life, or so I thought. I told myself I would never come back, that this place was too wild, too lonely, too heavy with things I couldn't explain. Then the letter came. Grandfather was gone, found sitting in his chair by the fireplace, as if he had just closed his eyes for a nap. By the terms of his will, the outpost and all the responsibilities attached to it passed to me. Tilson's point has always been a Tilson's job, he had written years ago in his journal. Someone has to watch the water. Someone has to log the fog. Someone has to make sure the line stays drawn. I arrived on a gray Tuesday in early October. The drive out from the nearest town, almost 40 miles of winding, isolated road, was a narrow, winding path carved into the cliffside, with steep drops to the ocean on one side and dense, ancient rainforest pressing in on the other. The trees here are massive, Sitka spruce and western red cedar, draped in moss that hangs like damp lace, blocking out almost all sunlight. Even at midday, it felt like dusk. The road was pitted and broken, rarely maintained, as if the county had long ago decided this stretch of land wasn't worth fighting for. The station itself sat right at the very tip of the headland, isolated, exposed, surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. It wasn't a lighthouse. Those had been automated decades ago. This was a weather station and monitoring outpost, a sturdy 2-story building made of heavy timber and stone, built low to the ground to withstand the gale-force winds that regularly batter the coast. It had been in my family since the 1920s. A square, functional structure, painted a faded red that had turned brown with age and salt spray, with a wide deck running all the way around and a tall radio mast rising from the roof, swaying gently in the constant breeze. There was no internet here, no cell service. The only connection to the outside world was an old marine radio and a weekly supply boat that came only when the sea state allowed, which wasn't often. It was a place time had forgotten, or perhaps a place time had simply decided not to visit anymore. I stepped out of my truck, pulling my coat tighter around me against the biting wind. The air was saturated with moisture. Within seconds, droplets were beating on my sleeves and hat. The sound of the ocean was overwhelming, a constant, deep thunder that vibrated in my chest and bones. But there was something else, too. A silence underneath the noise. A heavy, waiting stillness that pressed against my ears. The kind of silence that means something is watching, holding its breath, waiting for you to make the first move. I unlocked the heavy front door, the key turning stiffly in the lock after years of only being turned by one man's hand, and stepped inside. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke, old paper, damp wool, and iodine. It smelled exactly like my grandfather, exactly like home. For a second, just a fleeting second, I felt like a boy again, running in from the rain to find him sitting there, pipe in hand, watching the water. The interior was preserved exactly as he had left it. Maps covered the walls, tidal charts, weather patterns, depth soundings, hand-drawn diagrams of currents and reefs. Shelves were filled with books on oceanography, botany, and local folklore. Legends of the mists, marine phenomena, or portents. The boundary between tides. In the center of the main room stood a large desk, scarred and worn smooth by decades of use, and on it, a massive leather-bound logbook, open to the very last entry. I walked over and read it. The handwriting was shaky, but precise, written just 3 days before he died. His hand had been trembling, but the words were firm, etched deep into the paper as if he had been afraid they might fade away. Visibility, 0. Ceiling, indefinite. Fog bank, established at 0400 hours. Note: fog here is not just water. Do not mistake it for weather. It hides more than the view. It is a bridge, a road made of mist and moisture. When it comes, do not open doors. Do not answer knocks. Do not look out of the glass if the gray is thick enough to blur the line between sea and sky. They travel in it. It brings them right to your door. Dry wood and salt are the only walls they cannot cross. Keep the fire lit. Keep the thresholds dry. If you hear voices, remember, they are not calling you to come out. They are calling to invite themselves in. I ran my fingers over the words, the indentations rough under my fingertips. I remembered him saying things like that when I was a boy. Stories to keep me close to the house, to keep me from wandering off into the mist where I might get lost or fall off a cliff. Old fishermen's tales. Local superstition meant to make a child behave. Or so I had always believed. Standing here now, surrounded by the silence and the salt, the words felt less like a story and more like a warning carved into a survival manual. I spent the first day getting settled. I stocked the pantry with the supplies I had brought, checked the generators and fuel stores, tested the radio equipment, and familiarized myself with the instruments. Anemometers, barometers, hygrometers, tide gauges, and a complex system of mirrors and lenses used to scan the horizon. My job was simple, written clearly in the operating manual left on the shelf. Record conditions every 4 hours. Report to the Coastal Guard at 0800 and 2000. Mark pressure changes, wind direction, and visibility. That is all. Do not deviate. Do not investigate anomalies. Do not leave the station during fog events. By late afternoon, the sun began to sink, though you couldn't actually see it. The sky just went from a lighter shade of gray to a darker, heavier one, the light fading out like a lamp being turned down. The wind picked up, howling through the rigging of the mast and whistling around the eaves of the house, sounding almost like voices crying out in distress. And then, the fog began to roll in. I watched it from the west-facing window on the upper floor, the observation room, the best vantage point on the whole headland. I had seen fog before, of course. I had driven through it, walked in it, lived in cities where it lingered in the mornings. But nothing like this. It didn't drift or swirl or move in wisps. It arrived like a solid wall, a dense white-gray mass moving fast across the water, swallowing the waves, swallowing the horizon, swallowing the world. It moved with purpose, flowing between the sea stacks, creeping up the cliffs, surging over the headland until it hit the walls of the station itself. It was thick enough that I could almost reach out and grab a handful. Within minutes, I was sealed inside a bubble of white. I couldn't see the ocean anymore. I couldn't see the trees 50 yards away. I could barely see the deck railing just 10 feet from the glass. Visibility, 0. Just like Grandfather wrote. There was something different about this mist, though. It wasn't cold exactly. It was tepid, unnervingly warm, like bath water or the inside of a mouth. And it hummed, a low, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth and in the soles of my feet, a frequency that made my skin prickle and my head ache slightly. I turned away from the window and went downstairs to make dinner. I lit the wood stove, the heart of the place, and sat at the table with a cup of black coffee, listening to the wind howl and the rain begin to hammer against the roof and walls. It was wild, harsh weather, but the house was solid. It was built for this. Every timber was doubled, every joint sealed with oakum and tar, every window reinforced with heavy iron shutters that I now noticed were bolted from the inside. I felt safe, secure. Or at least, I told myself I did. At 8 p.m., I went to the radio to make my first scheduled report. I turned the set on, waiting for it to warm up, the tubes glowing softly behind the glass, then keyed the mic. Coastal Guard, this is Tilson's Point Station. Over. Static hissed back at me. Loud, heavy, wet static. It sounded less like electrical interference and more like thousands of tiny voices whispering all at once. Coastal Guard, Tilson's Point. Reporting conditions. Wind south-southwest, sustained 40 knots. Pressure dropping rapidly. Heavy fog bank covering the entire sector. Visibility near 0. Over. I waited. Usually there would be a crackle, a confirmation, a voice saying, "Copy that, Tilson. Noted. Stay safe." But this time, the static changed. It shifted, becoming deeper, rhythmic. It sounded almost like breathing, or like waves crashing but slowed down, deepened, transmitted through metal and air from miles beneath the surface. And then, cutting through the noise, clear and sharp, came a voice. Not the dispatcher's voice, not a voice I knew. It sounded waterlogged, thick, as if the speaker had been holding their breath underwater for a very long time. Tilson, we are inbound. Visibility is bad. Need guidance. Lights out. Can you hear us? I frowned, leaning closer to the set, turning the volume down slightly. It sounded like a ship's captain. Someone lost in the fog. Someone drifting too close to the reefs. But there were no ships scheduled in this sector. Not this far out. Not in this weather. This is Tilson's Point, I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. Identify yourself. What is your position? There are no running lights visible, and radar shows nothing within 10 miles. Over. We are close. So close. Just off the rocks. Can't see anything. Open the door. Signal us. Please. The voice was strange, flat, hollow. It didn't sound distressed exactly. It sounded expectant, hungry almost. And there was a strange echo to it, as if it were being spoken in a vast, empty cavern, rather than over a radio wave. Maintain course due west, I instructed, following standard procedure exactly as the manual said. Move away from the shoreline. I cannot see you. I cannot assist if you are within the breakers. Over. We aren't on the water, Nicholas. We are at the door. My blood turned to ice. My hand slipped from the microphone, falling limply to my side. The voice had changed. It was no longer the captain. It was deeper, rougher, and it had said my name. Not Tilson. Not operator. Nicholas. We followed the gray. It brought us right to your door. Open up. It's rude to keep guests waiting. The radio went dead. Complete silence. No static. No hum. Just absolute dead air, as if the machine had been cut off from the entire world. I pulled back from the desk, staring at the black plastic box. How did they know my name? Nobody knew I was here yet. I had only arrived that morning. The official logs still listed my grandfather as the operator. I hadn't spoken to a soul since I left the highway. I stood up slowly, moving toward the front of the house. I told myself it was a prank, a freak signal bounce, some local ham radio operator messing with the new guy. The coast here was weird with signals. Mountains and saltwater did funny things to transmissions. Bounced voices from 50 miles away. Distorted sounds until they sounded like they were in the room. But then, I heard it. From outside the front door, over the roar of the wind and rain, came a sound. 3 distinct, heavy knocks. Bam, 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 hard, solid, right on the wood. Not the wind rattling the frame, not a branch scraping the paint. Knuckles, or something very much like knuckles. I froze. There was no road beyond the station, no neighbors. No one could walk here in this weather, not without being swept off the cliff or lost in the mist within 10 steps. The supply boat wasn't due for 6 days. The nearest living soul was 20 miles away by sea. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak against the storm, barely carrying past my own lips. No answer. Just the wind screaming, rising in pitch to a high, eerie wail. Then, from the side of the house, near the kitchen window, I heard another sound, a dragging noise, wet and heavy, like something large and slick and boneless being pulled over the wood of the deck. Slap, drag, slap, drag, and voices, low, murmuring voices, just on the edge of hearing. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out words, but it was just a wash of sound, like many people talking at once, or like the echo of a crowd coming from far away underground, distorted by water and time. Here, safe, home, warm, open, let us in. Been so long, cold, wet. I remembered the logbook entry again, burning in my mind. Do not answer knocks. Do not look out. I backed away from the door, moving toward the fireplace where I kept a heavy iron poker leaning against the stones. It was cold iron, heavy and solid, and I gripped it tight in both hands. I wasn't a superstitious man. I was a rational man, an engineer by trade. someone who dealt in facts and figures and physics. But rationality doesn't account for voices that know your name coming over a dead radio. It doesn't account for visitors arriving in weather that no human, no animal, no boat could possibly survive. I went to the window anyway, curiosity warring with fear. I had to know. I had to see. I pulled the heavy velvet curtain aside just an inch and peered out, pressing my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the light from inside so my reflection wouldn't block the view. Outside, the fog was thicker than I had ever seen it. It was no longer white or gray. It had taken on a strange, blue-gray luminescence, glowing faintly from within, as if lit by something beneath the surface, something cold and bioluminescent like deep-sea creatures. And moving within that glow, shapes. They weren't people. They were too tall, too thin, their outlines shifting and blurring at the edges, constantly melting back into the mist and reforming again, as if they were made of the same stuff as the fog itself, only denser. They moved slowly, deliberately, pacing the perimeter of the house. I counted 5, 6, more, circling the building like wolves around a campfire, or sharks circling a sinking ship. They didn't have faces, not exactly. Where heads should have been, there were just darker smudges in the fog, denser concentrations of shadow, elongated and flowing upward. But they were looking. I could feel it. Hundreds of eyes, or whatever they used to see, fixed on the glass, fixed on the warm light spilling out from my home, fixed on me. One of them stopped right in front of my window, so close I could have reached out and touched it if the glass wasn't there. It raised a long, limb-like appendage, jointed too many times, webbed and pale, and touched the pane. I saw the print it left behind. It wasn't a handprint. It was a smear of moisture and salt and something darker, something organic and slimy that hissed and steamed as it hit the cold glass, leaving a trail that wouldn't evaporate. "Nicholas!" The voice came from everywhere at once, outside, inside my head, vibrating through the floorboards and the walls and the very air in my lungs. It sounded like my grandfather, then like my mother, then like voices I had heard on the street years ago, then like no voice I had ever heard, ancient and vast. "You think the fog is just water? You think it's just clouds that fell down? It's a road. It's a bridge between where they are and where you are, and we have been crossing it for a very long time. Your grandfather knew. He never let us in. He kept the lines drawn tight. But he's gone now. And you don't know the rules, do you? You don't know that you are the only thing holding the door shut." I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt to breathe. I looked around the room, at the maps, at the books, at the heavy timber walls, at the iron bolts on every shutter and lock on every door. I realized then that this house wasn't built just to withstand wind and rain. It wasn't built just to keep the weather out. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the iron poker still gripped tight in my hands, knuckles white and aching. The realization hit me with the force of a wave. This building wasn't just a station, or a home, or an inheritance. It was a fortress, constructed over decades, designed specifically to hold back whatever moved in the mist. Every beam, every plank, every layer of tar and oakum sealing the joints wasn't there for the wind. It was there for them. I remembered the note in the logbook again. Dry wood and salt are the only walls they cannot cross. My eyes darted around the room, searching. On a shelf near the door, lined up neatly in glass jars, were stacks of coarse sea salt, harvested right from the rocks below. Beside them sat boxes of thick, untreated rope and bundles of kindling cut from driftwood that had dried for years. It wasn't just supplies, it was ammunition. A loud crack echoed through the house, followed immediately by the splintering sound of wood under immense pressure. It came from the front porch. I rushed to the window, keeping well back from the glass, and peered out through a narrow gap in the curtains. The shapes were closer now. They were no longer just pacing. They were pressing against the walls, merging their misty forms with the physical wood and stone. Where they touched, the paint bubbled and peeled, turning dark and damp as if rotting instantly. The fog itself seemed to be thickening, condensing into heavier, more solid forms. I watched as one of them flowed up the pillar supporting the porch roof, moving like water flowing uphill, wrapping itself around the timber support. The wood groaned. I could feel the vibration through the floor beneath my feet. They weren't just trying to get in. They were trying to dissolve the barrier entirely, turning solid matter back into the same wet, malleable substance they were made of. I moved fast. I ran to the shelf, grabbed 2 large jars of salt, and sprinted to the front door. I remembered seeing my grandfather do this once when I was small, a ritual I had thought was just old habit or superstition. Now I understood. I twisted the lids off and poured a heavy, unbroken line of salt across the threshold, from one side to the other, and up the jambs on both sides until it reached the top of the frame. As the last grain fell, a high-pitched shriek sounded from outside, half wind, half voice, full of rage and pain. The dark, wet stain that had been creeping up the doorframe hissed and retreated, evaporating into thin air where it met the white crystals. It worked. It actually worked. Encouraged, I grabbed more jars and did the same for every window, every door, every vent, every crack where outside air might seep in. I poured salt along the baseboards, around the fireplace hearth, and along the edges of the floor where the timber met the stone foundation. It took every jar I had, leaving nothing in reserve. But by the time I finished, the entire ground floor was outlined in a shining, white perimeter. The noise outside changed instantly. The scratching, the dragging, the heavy thuds. They stopped moving closer. Instead, they began to circle, keeping their distance from the walls, roaring their frustration in low, booming tones that shook the very ground. Clever boy. Learned the trick fast. But salt dissolves, Nicholas. Salt washes away. And we have all night. The voice came from the radio again, which had sparked back to life without me touching it. It sat on the desk, dials spinning wildly on their own, broadcasting the sounds of a crowd wailing, of waves crashing miles deep, of wood splintering underwater. You think this started when you arrived? This started long before you were born. Every Tilson who stood here drew this line. Every one of them kept us out. But every one of them eventually made a mistake. Every one of them eventually got tired. Every one of them eventually got lonely. I looked up at the staircase leading to the second floor. The observation room. The room with the big windows facing directly out to sea. the room where the glass was large and unprotected by porches or overhangs. I heard it then. Drip, drip, drip. Slow, rhythmic, coming from above. I took the stairs 2 at a time, poker raised, heart hammering. The air grew warmer as I climbed, heavy and humid, smelling strongly of brine and rot. When I reached the landing, I saw it. Water was seeping through the ceiling. Not rainwater. Rain ran off the roof. It never got inside. This was coming through the wood itself, bubbling up between the planks, dark and salty, smelling of the deep ocean. It pooled on the floorboards, spreading outward in dark, wet rings. I rushed forward but stopped short. The salt lines I had laid downstairs hadn't reached up here. Up here, there was no barrier, and the fog was already inside. It wasn't filling the whole room. Not yet. It was concentrated around the large observation window, swirling in thick, tight coils, glowing with that same sickly blue-gray light. It had come through the glass, or perhaps become the glass, blurring the distinction between inside and out. Standing within that swirling mist, pressed right up against the pane, was a figure taller than the doorframe, thin and elongated, its skin glistening like wet scales. It had no face, just a smooth, pale expanse that rippled like water. But from where a mouth should have been, a long, thin tendril of mist reached out, touching the glass, tracing patterns I couldn't quite understand. "Your grandfather let us in here once," the thing whispered, the voice echoing inside my skull. Just for a moment. Just to talk. He missed his wife, you see. She died before her time, out on the water. We told him we had her. We told him she was here, in the gray, waiting for him. He almost opened the window. Almost let the whole tide roll in. I remembered the sadness I had seen in grandfather's eyes those last few years. The way he would sit for hours, staring out at the mist, looking for something I couldn't see. He hadn't just been watching the weather. He had been fighting a war every single night, against loneliness, against grief, against them. He held out, the voice continued, sounding almost admiring. But he is gone now, and you, Nicholas, you miss the sun. You miss the cities. You miss having people around you. You are already lonely. You are already tired. How long will you hold the line before you decide that having anyone to talk to is better than being alone forever? The figure shifted, and the mist swirled thicker, blocking out the light from the stars outside. From the heart of the cloud, shapes began to form. Shapes I recognized. My parents. Standing there, young and smiling, exactly as they looked in photographs before the accident that took them both. They reached out toward me, hands pressing against the inside of the fog, looking sad and welcoming. "Come to us, Nick," my mother's voice called, soft and warm. "It's so cold out here. Come open the window. We've been waiting for you." Behind them, other faces appeared. Friends I hadn't seen in years. Old neighbors. Even the girl I had loved and lost long ago. All smiling, all calling my name, all saying how much they missed me, how much they loved me, how perfect it was here in the mist, where no one ever aged, no one ever died. No one was ever apart. This was their weapon. Not claws or teeth or brute strength. They used what every human being eventually feels. The ache of absence, the pain of loss, the desperate, deep-seated need to be connected. They didn't want to break the door down. They wanted me to unlock it. They wanted me to decide that joining them was better than staying here alone. This was the true nature of the conflict. It wasn't man versus monster. It was human heart versus the void. I stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the iron bar until my hands shook. I wanted nothing more in that moment to walk forward, to open the glass, to reach out and touch my mother's face, to hear her voice clearly, to stop feeling so isolated and small on this point of rock, surrounded by endless cold ocean. But I remembered grandfather's last entry. Do not deviate. Do not investigate anomalies. Do not leave the station during fog events. And more importantly, I remembered what else he had written, scrawled in the margin in red ink. They are not what they look like. They are only what you want to see. You aren't them, I said aloud, my voice cracking but firm. My mother is gone. My parents are gone. The people I love are gone. You are just mist. You are just noise and water and hunger. The faces changed instantly. The smiles melted away. The warm, loving expressions warped into something jagged, sharp, and terrifying. My mother's face stretched and elongated, the mouth splitting open to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. My father's eyes turned black and hollow, sinking deep into his head. The friends became twisted, waterlogged corpses, skin peeling away, bones showing through. The illusion shattered completely, revealing the true form beneath, a writhing mass of tendrils, bubbles, and dark water, swirling violently with rage. Fool! The roar shook the walls, knocking pictures off the shelves. We gave you what you wanted! We gave you everything! We are the only thing that lasts. The sea takes everything eventually. We are the sea's memory. You will join us. We will wear your face. We will use your voice to call the next one who comes. The water dripping through the ceiling turned into a steady stream, pouring down in sheets now, soaking the carpet, running toward my feet. The fog at the window pressed harder, the glass bowing outward under the immense pressure, groaning like a living thing about to break. I realized then why the escalation pattern was different here. It wasn't about revealing history or building trust. It was about pressure and saturation. Contact, introduce themselves, test boundaries. Lure, use memory and desire to invite entry. Aggression, when lure fails, overwhelm the physical barrier. Dissolution, turn the environment itself into water/mist to bypass defenses. They were saturating the house. If everything inside became wet, became part of their element, the salt wouldn't matter anymore. The dry wood wouldn't matter. There would be no boundary left. I backed away from the window, scanning the room. I needed something more than salt. I needed something that actively repelled them, something that belonged entirely to the land, to the dry, solid world they couldn't stand. My eyes fell on the fireplace chimney rising through the center of the house, and next to it, the stack of driftwood logs and a metal bin full of ash and charcoal from previous fires. Fire. They were water. They were cold. They thrived in damp and dark. I ran to the woodpile, grabbed an armful of dry kindling and logs, and hurled them onto the small hearth in the upstairs room. I struck a match, and within seconds, a bright, hot blaze was roaring up the flue. The heat radiated outward instantly, drying the air, evaporating the puddles on the floorboards before they could spread. The reaction was immediate. The fog recoiled from the window as if burned. The shapes shrieked and pulled back from the glass. The water dripping from the ceiling slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely, turning back into harmless condensation. "Burn it all!" the voice screamed, sounding terrified now. "Burn the line and there is nothing left. You will be alone in the ashes forever." "I'd rather be alone in the ashes than dead in the deep," I shouted back, feeding more wood into the fire, making it hotter, brighter, fiercer. I grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table and smashed it open on the hearth, dousing the logs in fuel. The fire roared upward, turning blue and white with intensity. The heat became unbearable, but I didn't move away. I stood there, letting the dry, scorching heat fill the room, fill the house, dry out every timber, every crack, every inch of space. Outside, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled like a banshee. The waves crashed against the cliff so hard the ground shook, and the fog swirled in a frenzy of white and gray, battering the house, trying one last time to force its way in. But the line was drawn. The boundary was solid. Salt at the thresholds. Fire at the center. Dry wood holding fast. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the pressure eased. The blue glow faded from the mist. The shapes dissolved back into simple fog. The voices softened from screams to whispers, then to murmurs, then to nothing at all. Just like before, but slower this time, the fog began to retreat. It flowed backward, away from the walls, away from the glass, rolling down the headland, flowing back into the sea, dragging its disappointment and rage with it. I stood by the fire until the wood burned down to glowing embers, until the room was hot and dry and safe. I was soaked, exhausted, trembling from head to toe, but I was whole. I hadn't opened the door. I hadn't broken the line. I hadn't let them in. I walked to the window and looked out. The sky was clear again, the stars sharp and cold above the endless black water. The ocean stretched out to the horizon, vast and beautiful and terrible, and far out, just at the edge of sight, where the sea met the sky, I saw it. A thin, distinct line of gray waiting there, waiting for the sun to go down, waiting for the temperature to drop, waiting to roll in again. They hadn't left. They had just pulled back to regroup. I turned away from the window and went back downstairs. I swept up the salt that had saved me, gathered every remaining piece of dry wood I could find, and checked the seals on every door and window again. I understood now why this place had been in the family for generations. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a duty. A continuous, unending watch. Grandfather hadn't died of old age. He had died because he was tired. He had died because after 60 years of drawing the line, of fighting the loneliness, of standing guard against the mist, he had simply run out of strength. And now, that strength was mine to find. I sat down at the desk, opened the logbook to a fresh page, and picked up the pen. I wrote the time, the wind speed, the pressure, and the visibility. And then I added my own note, right below his. Fog event, 2200 to 3:30. Activity, extreme. They know my name. They know what I miss. Protections, salt maintained. Fire kept burning. Boundary intact. Note, they don't just hide the view. They hunt what is inside you. As long as I am here, the line holds. I am a Tilson, and we do not open the door. Morning came pale and washed out, the sun barely managing to pierce the lingering dampness that clung to the headland like a ghost. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the echoes of their voices, my mother's, my grandfather's, the faceless multitude, whispering that I didn't have to be alone. I sat by the hearth, feeding small branches into the glowing embers, keeping the air dry and warm, watching the window for any sign of the gray returning. The house was quiet now, but it was a different kind of silence. Before, it had felt like the silence of abandonment, of a place forgotten by the world. Now, it felt like the silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops, heavy, tense, and full of the memory of violence. I stood up and walked the perimeter, checking every door, every window frame, every seam in the timber. The salt lines I had laid were still there, white and crystalline, though some had crumbled or shifted. I swept them back into unbroken ridges, replenishing what I could from the few handfuls I had salvaged from the jars. It wouldn't last forever. I needed more. I needed supplies that didn't run out. I pulled on my heavy oilskin coat and boots, checking the sky one last time. It was clear, for now. The fog bank lay far out, a dark smudge on the horizon, waiting. I took the bucket hanging by the back door and made my way down the steep, rocky path that led to the shoreline below the point. The air here tasted sharper, saltier. The waves crashed against the black rocks, throwing spray high into the air. This was the source of everything. This was where the water met the land, where the line was thinnest. I knelt down beside a natural basin carved into the rock, filled with seawater left by the receding tide. This was how grandfather had done it. This was how every Tilson before him had kept their supply steady. I filled the bucket, heavy and cold, and began the climb back up. As I walked, I looked out across the water. I saw the sea stacks rising like ancient sentinels from the surf, their tops covered in moss and grass, their bases battered by endless waves. I realized then that they weren't invaders. Not exactly. They were natives. They belonged to this place, to the mist and the deep water, to the spaces where definition dissolves. We were the intruders. We were the ones who built solid things, who drew lines, who said, "This is land, that is sea, this is real, that is not." And every single one of my ancestors had stood right here, exactly where I stood now, doing the same thing, maintaining the barrier, defining the world so it wouldn't dissolve into gray nothingness. Back at the station, I set up a metal tray over a slow fire in the backyard sheltered from the wind. I poured the seawater in and let it boil down, evaporating the liquid until only thick, coarse crystals remained. Pure salt. Hard, dry, crystalline matter, the antithesis of mist and flow. While the water reduced, I went back inside and returned to the logbook. I hadn't finished reading it. I had only skimmed the warnings and the events. Now, in the harsh light of day, I needed to understand the full weight of what I had inherited. I read entries spanning nearly 100 years. I read about storms that lasted weeks, where the fog never lifted and the knocking went on day and night. I read about men who had gone mad from the loneliness, from hearing voices that sounded exactly like the people they missed most. I read about the one time the line had almost broken, back in the 1950s, when a storm surge had flooded the ground floor, washing away every grain of salt. That operator had barricaded himself in the attic for 3 days, burning furniture, books, clothes, anything dry enough to ignite, just to keep the mist from solidifying around him. And I read the most terrifying truth of all, written in the earliest pages. We do not just keep them out, we keep it in. This point is not just a house, it is a plug, a cork in the bottle. If this line fails, if this station falls or is opened, the fog does not just take this land. It rolls inland. It covers the forests, the mountains, the towns. It brings them with it. The whole coast becomes the graveyard. The whole world becomes the gray. My hands shook as I turned the page. I wasn't just protecting myself. I wasn't just fulfilling a family obligation. I was holding back a tide that could swallow civilization itself. That was the true moral dilemma I had missed the night before. It wasn't just isolation versus connection. It was my peace versus everyone else's reality. If I opened that door to end my loneliness, I would sentence thousands, millions, to live in a world where nothing was solid, where nothing was true, where every dead loved one was just a predator wearing a memory-like skin. The temptation I had felt, the overwhelming urge to step into the mist just to hear a familiar voice, was exactly what they counted on. It was the lever they used to move the world. By mid-afternoon, I had harvested enough salt to refill every jar, enough to line the house 3 times over. I also gathered armfuls of driftwood from the beach, stacking them under cover until the pile was as tall as the house itself. Dry wood, fuel, solidity. I went to the radio next. I hadn't sent a report since the night before. I keyed the mic, my voice steady and clear. Coastal Guard, Tilson's Point. Over. Static. Clean and normal this time. No voices, no breathing. Tilson's Point. We copy. We were getting concerned. Signal was lost for several hours last night. Heavy activity reported along the whole coast. System moving out now. All clear. Over. Copy that, I replied. Heavy fog event here. Pressure extreme. All systems intact. Station secure. Over. Roger that, Tilson. You guys always get the worst of it. Supply boat is rescheduled for day after tomorrow. Hold fast. Over and out. I sat back, staring at the radio. They called it activity. They called it weather systems. To the rest of the world, this was just a dangerous coastline. Bad visibility. Maritime hazards. They didn't know the truth. They couldn't. If they knew what really waited in the mist, fear would make them open the doors faster than loneliness ever could. Ignorance was their protection. My knowledge was my burden. As the day faded, the light turning that familiar steel-gray color, I began my preparations for the night. I didn't just rely on salt and fire anymore. I worked with the very nature of the place. I hammered wedges of dry cedar into every crack and joint, driving them tight so no dampness could seep through. I strung ropes of dried kelp, harvested at low tide and cured until it was hard as bone, around the porch and deck supports, creating a lattice of organic, solid matter that resisted the flow. I placed bowls of pure, coarse salt at every corner of the foundation, forming a geometric seal, a circle of definition that said, "This ends here. This is distinct. This is real." And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Just after sunset, I saw it coming. Far out on the horizon, The gray line rose up, swelling, expanding, moving faster than the wind, faster than the tide. It rolled over the sea stacks, swallowed the waves, and surged toward the point like an invading army. But this time, I wasn't hiding behind curtains. I stood on the porch, salt bucket in hand, fire burning in the iron brazier I had dragged outside. I stood at the exact edge of the boundary, where wood met stone met air. The fog hit. It was heavier, thicker, more aggressive than before. It slammed against the house with physical force, shaking the walls, pressing against me, cold and wet and suffocating. The blue luminescence flared bright, illuminating the entire headland in ghostly radiance. "There he is," the voices murmured, thousands speaking as one, swirling around me but unable to cross the white line at my feet. "The new keeper, the one who learned fast. You think salt and wood and fire are enough? You think you can stand here forever, Nicholas? You are human. You tire. You grieve. You miss. We have all the time in the world. We can wait 100 years. We can wait until you are old, until you are sick, until you are so lonely you would welcome the end just to hear a voice that sounds like love." From the mist, the shapes formed again. Not just my family this time. I saw grandfather. I saw him standing tall and straight, pipe in hand, looking exactly as he did 10 years ago, exactly as he did before the weight broke him. "Let it go, Nicholas," the illusion said, his voice soft and weary. "It's too much for one man, too much for anyone. Come into the gray. It's peaceful here. No more cold. No more watching. No more being alone. We are all together here. Everyone who ever stood where you stand. Everyone who ever waited." It was the deadliest lure of all. Not just my parents, but the man I had admired most. The man who had given his life to this duty, now telling me to abandon it. Telling me it was okay to quit. Telling me that he was here, safe and happy, waiting for me to join him. I felt the pull. It was stronger than anything I had ever felt. The weight of the last 24 hours, the exhaustion, the crushing isolation, the knowledge of what I had to do for the rest of my life. It all crashed down on me. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to be with him. I wanted it to be over. But then I remembered his logbook. I remembered the trembling handwriting in the final entries. I remembered the way he had written, "I am tired," over and over again in the margins. That wasn't him in the mist. The real him had stayed behind. The real him had died in that chair, exhausted but unbroken, keeping the line drawn until his very last breath. The thing in the fog was just using his face, using his voice, using his fatigue to trick me into undoing everything he had protected. "You aren't him," I said, my voice ringing clear and loud through the thick white air. "My grandfather didn't quit. My grandfather didn't ask me to break the seal he spent 60 years maintaining. He taught me that loneliness is better than nothingness. He taught me that some things are worth guarding, even if you never get to see the reward." I reached into the bucket at my feet and grabbed a handful of coarse salt. I didn't throw it. I held it up, letting the light of the fire glint off the sharp crystals. "He taught me that you aren't a paradise. You are a lie made of water and regret. You are the absence of everything real. And as long as I am here, you stay out there." I scattered the salt into the air, letting the wind carry it outward into the fog. Where the crystals landed, the mist hissed and boiled, evaporating instantly. The blue light flared and dimmed. The shape that looked like my grandfather shrieked and twisted, melting back into the writhing mass of gray. "You will break!" they screamed, the voices rising to a deafening crescendo. "Every keeper breaks! Every line fades! We are eternal! You are just flesh and blood and memory!" "Maybe," I shouted back, feeding more wood into the brazier until the flames roared high, casting long, sharp shadows that cut through the mist like knives. "But while I am here, I am solid. I am dry. And I am the line." The battle raged all night. They threw everything they had at me. They showed me my own funeral, showing people crying over my grave. They showed me a world where I was loved and celebrated, far away from this rock. They showed me nothingness, promising peace. And every time I answered with salt, with fire, with the solid weight of my will. I stood there on that porch, unmoving, unyielding, defining reality against their chaos. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray and beautiful, the fog began to recede. It pulled back slowly, reluctantly, flowing away from the point, retreating to the deep water, taking its rage and its lies with it. I sank onto the bench, completely spent, every muscle aching, my throat raw from shouting over the wind. I looked out over the empty ocean, over the rocks, over the forest. The world was still there, solid, real, defined. I stood up and went inside. I washed my face, drank deep from the fresh water barrel, and walked to the desk. I opened the logbook. I looked at the long line of names before mine. Tilson, 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 father to son, generation to generation. I picked up the pen. I wrote the date, the weather, the event. And then I wrote the truth I had discovered, the final understanding that would carry me through the years ahead. They say the fog hides the view. They say it brings them to the door, but that is only half of it. The fog tests you. It tests what you hold on to when everything else dissolves. It tests what you are made of when you are the only thing left standing between the world and the gray. I thought I came here to watch the weather. I thought I came here to finish a job. I was wrong. I came here because this is what I am. I am not a visitor. I am not just an heir. I am the keeper of the line, and as long as I draw breath, the line holds. I closed the book and placed my hand flat on the cover, over the names of all the men who had come before me. I understood now why they never left, why they never retired. You don't retire from a duty like this. You only pass it on, or you die standing. I walked back out onto the porch. The sun was rising higher, burning off the last traces of damp, lighting up the waves in streaks of gold and silver. Far out, I could see the bank waiting. It would come back tonight, and every night after that, for the rest of my life. I was 35 years old. I had a long time to stand guard, a long time to be alone, a long time to fight the voices that knew exactly who I was and exactly what I missed. But as I stood there, looking at the solid wood, the dry stone, the shining salt lines, and the endless, beautiful sea, I didn't feel fear anymore. I didn't feel regret. I felt purpose. I turned and went back inside to sharpen the axe, to boil more water, to stack more wood. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Because here on the Pacific Northwest coast, where the land meets the deep water and the mist falls heavy. Fog hides more than just the view. It brings them right to your door. And I am the one who answers.